Have you ever watched a massive container ship slowly cross the horizon? It looks incredibly peaceful, right? Well, legally speaking, that ship is actually a floating battleground of liabilities, rights, and incredibly complex international agreements. Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into the hidden mechanics of global trade to figure out exactly who is on the hook when ocean cargo gets lost, delayed, or damaged. We are going to decode a really foundational piece of this whole puzzle, the Indian Carriage of Goods by Sea Act of 1925. So let's just quickly run through our roadmap for today's journey. We'll start with the Wild West of shipping, then see how the 1925 Act arrived to restore some order. After that, we'll cover the rules of the high seas, look at how rights and responsibilities are balanced, and finally, explore what happens when other laws take over. All right, starting off with Section 1, the Wild West of shipping, specifically the era before 1924. To really appreciate this law, we kind of have to understand the total chaos that came before it. Back then, under the English common law that was administered in India, a sea carrier faced absolute liability. Basically, if something went wrong with the cargo, it was their fault, period. But here's the catch. The law also allowed for something called freedom of contract. So, carriers very quickly realized they could just use specialized clauses to literally write themselves out of practically all responsibility. It was a massive loophole. The whole system was completely unbalanced, leaving cargo owners with virtually zero protection against these giant maritime conglomerates. Which leads us right into Section 2. The 1925 Act arrives, basically stepping in as the great equalizer. To stop all this contractual abuse, the international community got together in 1924 and established the Hague Rules to standardize shipping. And India, well, they jumped right on board. In 1925, they enacted the Indian Carriage of Goods by Sea Act, taking those exact Hague Rules and making them the official schedule of the Act. This totally stripped away that old freedom of contract loophole and replaced it with precise, defined liabilities. And you know, the law hasn't just sat there gathering dust. In 1993, the Multimodal Transportation of Goods Act came along and amended the rules, upgrading everything to match modern global standards.
Now, this is absolutely crucial. The most brilliant pivot of this new law was getting rid of the old, practically impossible standard of an absolute undertaking to provide a seaworthy ship. Because let's face it, the ocean is completely unpredictable, right? Instead, they introduced the concept of due diligence. This means the carrier is now just obligated to make a reasonable effort to ensure the vessel is seaworthy. It's a really smart compromise. It protects cargo owners from blatant negligence, but it also gives ship owners a break when it comes to unavoidable acts of nature. Moving right along to Section 3, Rules of the High Seas, where we'll look at the jurisdiction and scope of the Act. So you might be wondering, does this law just blanket every single boat out there? Well, no. Across its 7 sections, the Act lays out 3 very specific steps that must be met for it to kick in. Step 1. You need outward cargo loaded from an Indian port. Though, quick side note, it does apply to coastal trade too, so the final destination can actually be inside or outside India. Step 2. A formal contract, called a bill of lading, has to be issued. And Step 3. That bill of lading must explicitly state in writing that the carriage is subject to these exact rules. If you're missing that clause, or there's no bill of lading at all, the Act simply doesn't apply.
But get this, even if you do meet all those requirements, there are some pretty surprising exemptions. If you're just moving goods within a port using small barges, you're entirely outside the Act's ambit. It also doesn't cover cargo strapped to the deck, or, and I found this fascinating, live animals. So yeah, any livestock on board, they're pretty much on their own, legally speaking. On top of that, sailing ships leaving India are exempt, along with certain historical trade routes to specific notified ports in Ceylon, which we of course know today as Sri Lanka.
There's also this highly specific carve-out for bulk cargo. Think massive shipments of coal or grain. Now, normally, whatever weight is written on the bill of lading is considered prima facie evidence. That's just legal speak for we accept this as fact until someone proves otherwise. But if it's customary in that specific trade to have a third party weigh the goods, and that independent weight is put on the document, the carrier isn't automatically on the hook if the numbers don't match up later. It's a great example of how the law actually adopts to the real-world customs of historical trading.
That takes us to Section 4, Balancing Rights and Responsibilities, or as I like to call it, the scales of justice.
At its core, this whole thing operates like a giant, high-stakes seesaw between the ship owner and the cargo owner. For every minimum responsibility a carrier has to shoulder, like providing that seaworthy vessel, carefully handling the cargo, and sticking to the route without unreasonable deviation, they are granted some seriously powerful rights in return.
We're talking strict financial limits on their liability, robust exemption clauses, and really tight deadlines for when a cargo owner can even file a notice of loss. It's a very carefully calibrated legal ecosystem.
And the physical boundaries of this ecosystem, they are incredibly strict. It all comes down to a concept known as tackle-to-tackle liability. This means the carrier's responsibility under the 1925 Act doesn't start when your goods are sitting at the port gates, and it doesn't extend to the warehouse at the end. The clock only starts ticking the moment the goods are hooked onto the ship's tackle for loading, and it stops the absolute second they are unhooked during discharge. They are quite literally only on the hook while the cargo is physically on the ship.
17. Keep that number in your head. Because amazingly, under Article 4, Rule 2 of the Act's schedule, there are exactly 17 specific exonerating clauses. If a carrier can prove that the damaged cargo falls under one of these 17 scenarios, which cover everything from acts of God to acts of war to saving a life at sea, they are entirely shielded from liability. So while they have responsibilities, the law hands them 17 distinct shields to protect themselves from being sued.
Finally, we've arrived at Section 5, when other laws take over. This is where we talk about the ultimate trump card.
Because as comprehensive as the 1925 Act is, it actually doesn't have the final say out there on the water. Section 2.8 of the Act explicitly says it won't mess with certain parts of the Merchant Shipping Act of 1958. Why does that matter? Well, imagine a massive, catastrophic disaster where multiple cargo owners are suing a single carrier. If the liability calculated under the 1925 Act absolutely skyrockets, the 1958 Merchant Shipping Act steps in and acts like a financial tourniquet. It legally caps the carrier's global liability to a lower, predetermined maximum amount. But that 1958 Act isn't just about limiting money. It also heavily dictates safety. And in certain situations, it completely overrides the 1925 rules. For example, if a ship is transporting dangerous goods or bulk grains, which are notorious for shifting around and literally capsizing vessels, the Merchant Shipping Act mandates strict, absolute special precautions. If the carrier fails to follow those, they are absolutely liable. None of that due diligence stuff matters, and those 17 shields we just talked about are completely thrown out the window.
So, as we wrap up this explainer, I really want you to think about this massive unseen architecture that makes our modern lives possible. The clothes you're wearing, the phone in your hand, the food in your kitchen, the whole shebang relies on this century-old balancing act of due diligence, tackle-to-tackle boundaries, and global legal trump cards. Next time you see one of those giant cargo ships cutting through the water, remember the high-stakes tug-of-war happening right beneath the surface, and ask yourself, if that ship goes down today, whose law is truly on board, and ultimately who ends up paying the price? Thanks for exploring the fascinating depth of maritime law with me.